Good afternoon. We made it. We made it. Welcome to Influence Nation. And so, by the way, we've got some incredible people here, and we also have some incredible people online that are joining us. And what we're doing today, my name is Derek Feldman, by the way, and I lead the Cause and Social Influence initiative. And as part of that initiative, our job is to try to understand how young Americans today are getting involved in social issues and movements. And in fact, this morning, we released some new research that has been out there on how young Americans view those movements, and in particular, the differences amongst our oldest Gen Z and our youngest millennials overall. And we're going to go through some of that research in just a minute. But today is a day where we're going to hear from some of the leaders behind those biggest movements and social issues that are in the research. And we've gathered them this afternoon, not only to hear about some of their successes and failures and challenges that they continue to go through, but we're also going to hear from some of the other ones that are looking forward to some things happening next year. I don't know if you've heard, we have an election going on next year. Yeah. So we'll end the day with an incredible panel on voting as well. And we've got some great people, including my colleagues at the Ad Council, who have been instrumental in part of this effort. Really, the Ad Council is our co-host, and without them, not only this, but in a couple other partners, we wouldn't make this possible. Because the Ad Council has been, for more than 75 years, tackling some of these biggest social issues and movements as well. I think we all know kind of the Smokey the Bear, right? As well. But I want to bring out my co-host and colleague and partner and friend, Kate Emanuel. Kate? Hi.
Hi, everyone. Derek, thanks for letting me share the stage and let the Ad Council share the stage today. And thanks for all of you for coming. And we have a lot of folks online, so thanks for joining us. We're going to have a really great program. The Ad Council works with the best and brightest talent at ad agencies, media companies, platform, tech companies, brands to create our campaigns. And it's a really terrific model because it's all pro bono. And today's topic is right up our alley. It's about social movements, youth. We have a number of youth campaigns, whether it's STEMming girls, preventing suicide amongst youth, bullying prevention, helping young adults get their high school diploma. And we've got a number of campaigns in the works on climate change and voter engagement. So I'm super excited. I know I'm going to learn a lot today, and we've got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to turn it back over to Derek.
Wonderful. Thanks,
Okay,
Kate.
sure.
All right, you're going to hear from Kate later on. She's moderating our voting panel, and she'll also share some really good research on voting that I was a part of as well. And later on when we discuss that, we'll hear from Andy and Yves about some of the work that they're working on related to next year. Now, I want to also thank and bring out another instrumental partner, and that's the Levi Strauss Foundation. And for a couple of years now, actually more than that, I think we were talking about 5 or so, the colleagues and partners and friends at the Levi Strauss Foundation have been instrumental in helping us communicate out, primarily even the social justice leaders who are in America doing incredible things. And when I say partner, I truly mean partner and not sponsor, because they partner with a lot of very important causes on some of the big issues that we're dealing with: immigration, voting, and a lot of other things. But I'm going to let Jason McBriarty come on out and fill us in a little bit more. Jason.
Great. Thanks, Derek. So I'm really honored to be here in New York on this gorgeous fall day. And actually, Derek, you're right. We've been a partner of Influence Nation for 5 years now, and we've been a sponsor for the last 3 years. And I last spoke on this stage in Washington, D.C. in 2016. And I think we all know that a lot of things have changed in this time. Arguably, it's the most consequential political moment for many of us in our lives, both here and abroad. And I think now more than ever, it's really important for us to gather in spaces like this to kind of decide what kind of a world we want to see, to use our collective voice to create change. That's why I'm really excited that today you're going to have a chance to hear from 2 incredible pioneers from the that's sponsored by the Levi Strauss Foundation. Robert Suttle of the Zero Project. It's an organization that seeks to end HIV/AIDS criminalization, incarceration, racism, and social injustice. And then Jess Morales-Racato from National Domestic Workers Alliance and Care in Action. 2 organizations that are dedicated to supporting and providing dignity to the millions and millions of domestic workers here in the United States, the majority of whom are women. We're honored to support their work. For more than 67 years, the Levi Strauss Foundation has embraced the energy and events of our time to sponsor and to support the issues of HIV and AIDS, workers' rights and well-being, as well as social justice. And through this work, we get to sponsor incredible pioneers like you're going to hear today, Robert and Jess. The two of them also embrace really the values of our company, values that both our company, our parent company, Levi's, as well as Levi Strauss Foundation embrace, and that's originality, empathy, integrity, and courage. You know, this current political moment is rife with disruptive change, and really it calls upon all of us, particularly the corporate sector, to kind of step up. And we believe that a corporation has more of an obligation than just delivering a profit. It also has to take a stand on the important issues of the day, and that's why, you know, beyond the Levi Strauss Foundation and the giving that we were able to give every year, about 8.5 million in total, we also have supported the important issues of the day through our company, and that's ending gun violence as well as encouraging people to vote in the United States. Shortly after the 2016 election, the Levi Strauss Foundation gathered and said, we want to do more. And so we created a rapid response fund to really to support those people that are living at the center of all that's happening right now. We're supporting organizations that protect civil liberties, highly vulnerable communities across the United States and abroad, including immigrants, refugees, members of the transgender community, and religious minorities. We have continued to support the Rapid Response Fund at $1 million a year over the last 2 years for a total of $3 million. We believe that as a company, a 156-year-old American company, an iconic American company, what we say about America really does matter. And you're about to hear from two incredible pioneers, Robert and Jess, that embody the highest ideals of what America can be. A country that embraces diversity and inclusion, welcomes all, because they know that together we are stronger. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate it. Thank you. All right. So as Jason had mentioned, there's some social issues and movements that Levi Strauss Foundation has been a part of, as well as the company. And we're going to hear about some of those. But that kind of leads into some things that we discovered today, or that we shared today in some of the research that we have. Specifically, when we look at some of that research, I have to thank a partner of ours that was helpful and instrumental in making it possible, which is Influential. They were some of the engine behind some of the early analytics to try to look at the largest social issues, movements, and campaigns out there that young America is getting active on. And as we took some of their insights, it brought us further into try to understand specifically how young Americans, those 18 to 30, are getting involved in social issues and movements. And as part of that, as we go through today, you can ask some questions, which we'll get through in a minute, but as part of that analysis that we released this morning, there's some very, very key differences when it comes to our different generations, in particular, gender as well. So specifically, this morning we released the Influencing Young America to Act report, which is a second in our series overall to try to understand those influences as well as the movements that young Americans are involved with. I'm going to share 5 of the total 7 key findings just quickly for you to get an understanding of what's happening when it comes to those young Americans as well. Our first thing that we did is to try to figure out specifically what is young America talking about and what are they actually acting on. Having conversations doesn't necessarily mean they're taking action. And that was really, really important that after we had a chance to hear from Influential and others about some of those big movements and social issues, we had to go back into the field to understand what young Americans are really doing. And when it happens, it's climate change. Now, you're going to hear from an individual behind the Sunrise Movement. She'll be on stage to share some of her work and what they're trying to do to galvanize this time as we're in right now. But climate change was the issue of concern. Now, right behind that, of course, civil rights and discrimination. A lot of the work that Jason was talking about as well. Immigration health care reform was number 4, and mental health and social services, which is why we look at if you look at those issues right there, that's why we have the individuals on stage here that you're going to hear from, including the incredible work from the Ad Council, which sees the Awkward campaign, which Lena and team will talk about later on. Now, in addition to our social issues of interest, we also look at those movements that are driving change and already participation from the 18 to 30-year-olds in America. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, interestingly enough, All Lives Matter number 3, human rights, and Medicare for All. In the report, you can see how these break down by both the oldest of Gen Z and the youngest of millennial, as well as by gender too. If you don't see your issue on there, don't worry. On the website today, which you'll see on the Cause and Social Influence website, we list all of the social issues and how they fared out amongst young Americans in our study. In addition to that, we had to look at the conversation topics, right? I mentioned earlier that Influential helped us to try to understand that. And there are a couple differences when it comes to those generations. Specifically, take a look at gun rights, gun safety, gun violence areas, as you see there. The conversation and gun control was about 84% with our Gen Z population versus our youngest millennials overall. That leads us to that conversation around gender, as I mentioned. Commonalities and differences. Where we actually saw commonality is around climate and civil rights and discrimination. Where we saw differences, and we would say that there needs to be more work done, was around men and women versus Me Too and the Women's March in particular. As you see some of this, you'll want to head back to the website to look at how that fared out amongst ages as well. That's the cliffhanger part of it, so you can go there next. The next thing I would say is we try to, as much as possible, to figure out how a person starts to understand, to become aware, to then how they take action. And then we always have to ask the question in the end, do you feel like what you did for the issue really mattered? Because how many of us want to do nothing, right? And or at least act a little bit, and if it doesn't matter. And as you'll see on this is a big graphic. I just share with you two big key takeaways. First, the news media on social is actually a source that a lot of young Americans are using to find out and become aware on the social issues overall. The other thing is now we asked and looked at all of the actions that they had taken. And those self-reported actions, voting was the one that they believe has the most opportunity to create change. And specifically, regardless, except for in mental health, we saw it as the leading thing that they plan to do, obviously, to make social issues change and be different in the coming years ahead. We had to ask the questions around where they view the country. Is it on track or not? And what we discovered is it's not as on track as we can imagine with the study with this population. So, in specifically looking at the administration, we actually asked questions, not necessarily do you agree, but rather, what do you think of the administration addressing the social issues of the time that you are of most concern with as well? And as you can see on the screen, 48% would say not well at all. Our next thing is around fake news. I'm sure you've all heard those two words used not that long ago, right? And maybe even today. We wanted to try to understand what is the attitude and perception of young America about fake news, and in particular on social issues and movements, and whether or not they view that fake news will actually be influential when it comes to the election. Specifically, what we discovered, big chart here, is about 78% of them view that fake news influences attitudes on social issues, primarily in social platforms, outside of some of the outlets we've talked about. And what we also discovered is a lot of them view that the election will be influenced by fake news on the issues that they care the most about. A little uneasy when it comes to some of that. You can head to the causeandsocialinfluence.com website to actually go to the research section, download the research, look at all of the issues and how they fared amongst our panel of Americans, nationwide national representative panel. You'll also be able to hear in the future, we are looking at all of these movements and we'll be tracking their participation from the organizational side next. Over the course of the next year, we're going to look specifically at how these movements are galvanizing support. You're going to hear from some of those today here as well. Well, I also want you to share some of your comments freely about the research as well as what you hear here on stage. Specifically, you'll have that chance, as I mentioned earlier, to enter in the questions in our Slido account, which is wonderful for you, so you get a chance to actually ask those questions here on stage. Our moderators will have an iPad, and so anybody online or in person can ask those questions, and the top voted questions are the ones that we are going to be asking on stage as well. So you're somewhat in control away from us. Let's be friendly, all right? Let's be friendly. Now, let's go ahead and get started. We wanted to open up with Robert. When we met Robert, there was one thing that in Robert's story that really hit us, and that is a lot of us are working for social change. A lot of us are working on some of these issues that we've just gone through. And when you're thinking about those issues, there's one thing that usually happens. And as somebody who studies movements and social issues in young Americans, I can tell you that people get tired. They get tired when change doesn't happen. And what you're going to hear from Robert is not only his personal journey and what affected with him, but also how his organization that he helped found has been fighting this for a very long time in general. Before I bring Robert out, I want to ask Reed Vreeland to join me. Reed is with Housing Works New York City. And what Reed is going to be doing will be introducing Robert as well. And Reed has been also working on this issue here in New York City, knows Robert, and was also actually a coworker and colleague. So we'll have a couple of friends up here talking about some of these issues. So Reed, come on out.
Thank you. So I have the distinct pleasure today to introduce Robert Suttle. Robert grew up born and raised in Louisiana, where he was working in his early career on Louisiana's Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And at that point in his life, in his, I believe, early 20s, Robert faced an unjust HIV criminalization prosecution. He was arrested, convicted, and incarcerated on one of these unjust, stigmatizing HIV criminalization laws. Upon his release in 2011, Robert has become the first person in the world, actually, to speak about his experience facing HIV criminalization and really helped start a movement to end HIV criminalization nationally, which he'll speak more about. Robert worked as assistant director at the Sero Project, which is a national network of people with HIV and allies dedicated to empowerment, ending HIV stigma, and HIV criminalization. And I would like to introduce Robert Suttle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. How are you all doing? Oh, good. It's an active audience. So I'm glad to be here to share with you in regards to the work that I've been doing and to also to enlighten you, and hoping that you will leave here today with something that resonates with you. And so getting involved in the social movement for change has really been beneficial in my life. And as you've heard in my background, that I was convicted 10 years ago, actually, in the state of Louisiana under the charge of intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. I've been living with HIV for 16 years now. At the time when I was newly diagnosed, I was not aware of any specific laws that pertain to people living with HIV. And so 5 years into my diagnosis, I was faced with this issue of allegedly not disclosing my status to a partner that I was involved with. And of course, it was a consensual adult relationship. And so this experience really changed my life. And so I ended up doing 6 months in Louisiana prison, faced a felony conviction, as well as having to register as a sex offender for 15 years. And so can you imagine, in the state of Louisiana, on their driver's license, they put in big red letters the word sex offender. And so imagine carrying that around as you go through life. And so going through that experience, I didn't know anything about these criminalization laws. I didn't know any person that actually had been criminalized. And so I went online and found a blog that really explained the things that I had gone through. And I contacted my colleague, whom I've since worked with, in regards to that. And so he basically introduced me to people who were beginning to work on this issue. And I was totally unaware. I was not an activist. I was not an advocate in any way. Normally when people are newly diagnosed, they kind of go into that. I was not that person. So my introduction to the movement, if you will, the HIV movement, was through my experience of being criminalized, which of course was something that not many people living with HIV actually talked about. And so it was a concern for me as I moved into the movement, how people will perceive me, because typically if a person thinks that if someone does not disclose their status to them, then they should be prosecuted. Something should happen to them. They should be punished. And so I wasn't sure how I was going to be received. And surprisingly, my community did receive me. They welcomed me in and they really supported me. And in so much, they allowed me to become a leader, become a voice around this issue, which at the time I was still learning, which is why I got involved in the movement, because I wanted to learn more about this issue and why it had the impact that it had in my life. And I did not want to see other people going through that experience also, because I am a regular person. I contracted HIV, just like any of us can. And also, I was someone that went to prison as any of us could go for any reason. So it can happen to anybody. And so in the movement, what I've learned is that, there are 30 plus states that have general criminal laws. They also have HIV-specific laws. So I encourage you to, go online and find out if your state has those laws. I was totally unaware. Other thing that I've learned in the movement is that these laws are so archaic, draconian, they're outdated. They don't reflect the science of what we know now around HIV. It's not like it was in the 80s. People today are living longer and healthier lives. And so HIV today is no longer a death sentence, it is a prison sentence. And so it doesn't reflect the science of the real risk and routes of transmission of HIV, which is a problem, because once antiretroviral treatment was introduced in the mid-90s, that changed everything for people living with HIV to live longer. And also, ultimately, even today, if they're on treatment and they're able to achieve an undetectable viral load, they cannot transmit HIV to anyone. And so how many of you may know that? Many of you may not, and that's okay. I'm sharing it with you today for you to learn and know that. Going forward. And so that should change the landscape of everything. The laws should change, right? Well, no, the laws never changed. No one has ever gone back to look at those laws that were introduced in the late 80s and 90s to say, hey, we need to change this now because people living with HIV cannot transmit HIV to anyone. And that's why my work is so important today, to bring awareness, to talk about the issue so that people are aware and able to govern themselves accordingly and to be empowered with knowledge to understand how to navigate through these circumstances, particularly for people living with HIV, but for the general public at large. And so since then, going to the movement, many people did not want to talk about HIV criminalization. They were, in my opinion, they were afraid to put it in the policies because it's such a controversial issue. It's about sex, it's about being gay or what have you. Which makes it very controversial. It's a very hot topic. And so a lot of public health people, legislators, you name it, all the people that are stakeholders who are involved in decision-making around laws and policies, they do not want to touch this. And also, there's a bit of racism, there's a bit of homophobia, transphobia, all the isms and things like that. And so people's personal biases get in the way of them, of making things better for communities of people who are already marginalized and who are also the minority. And so as we begin to, as I begin to, and along with some other people who I've been able to connect with who share their experiences about being prosecuted, it was through the storytelling that really changed hearts and minds of people. And even those that within the HIV community and even the LGBT community were really, really reluctant on us saying that, we do not need to be prosecuting people living with HIV. If someone does not disclose, then, people have a right to this information. But unfortunately, people don't necessarily have a right to this information because it's not legally safe for people to disclose. If we want people to disclose, we need to make it legally safe for them to do so. There have been stories of people being murdered as well as going to prison. I went to prison for 6 months, but there are people who've been convicted and gone to prison for 30 years, and they did not transmit HIV to anyone. So, let that sink in. So that is why it's so important that we need to change these laws. And so, so through storytelling and people really understanding the nuances of these issues, it really changed the movement in that we were able to come together and realize that that this is not acceptable for our community. And so since then, the way that we've been able to progress with change is that we started a training academy, if you will. It was organized by people living with HIV, for people living with HIV initially. And that was in 2014, which happens to also be a time when a state law actually changed, and that state was Iowa. It was the first state. And we've since had other states to change their laws, such as California, Colorado, and even North Carolina in terms of their public health code. And so through the storytelling, through the string of the nuances, through the training academy, it really has changed and build the momentum now for people wanting to change the laws in their states, so much that we have coalitions basically in most states today, particularly the South and the Midwest and other states where HIV criminalization prosecutions are definitely happening. The problem that we have limited data, which is a problem because we had to file Freedom of Information Acts to get whatever data we could in regards to the number of people who are being prosecuted. The thing is, the way the information is gathered, it makes it literally impossible to really get those numbers. But we do know it's happening because I'm a living witness that it does happen to you. And since then, I've been able to connect with a lot of other people that have been going through this experience and offering them that support. And coalitions are steady organizing because it varies from state to state. These are state laws. And so there's not just one federal law that could change, these things. It's state by state. And if we have 30 plus states, that's a lot of work. And so that means it's going to take some time to change. I actually got into this work kind of thinking for myself that, wow, if I get in, maybe I'll learn how to work this out for myself. But I decided to put that on the back burner, put myself on the back burner, and just really devote myself to really getting involved in making people aware of these laws. And instead of just retreating and just focusing on myself. And because I care about this issue, and I care about people, and I care about what happens to people in my community, in the LGBT community as well as the HIV community, in the Black community. I care about people, and that is why I do what I do. And so having the limited data, we've still been able to push forward and understanding this is not easy. Some states, for Iowa, it took them at least 7 years before they got to the point where they could actually introduce legislation to change. And so since then, those other states that I mentioned earlier, they've been able to follow suit. So it's kind of happened quickly, but it takes a long time. We still have more states to go. Some states are able to move faster than others in terms of based on their political reality. But this is serious work, and it's really hard, and it's very controversial. And so it's easy to give up because you know that things can change, things can be better, but it's the convincing the powers that be as to how that change can happen. Science is on our side. So, there's nothing else there but except people accepting the truth and accepting the facts. And so what I say to people is that, don't be discouraged. Hang in there. For me, this has been my ministry. The thing that has brought me misery, I don't know if many of you have ever faced a conviction in your life, have ever even been arrested in your life, or whatever thing that pains you. For me, this was my ministry, and it still is, and it will continue to be for the rest of my life. And the good thing that I like about it is that people now are able to speak about this for themselves and make the change. And so I encourage all people that are interested in this work to learn about it, educate yourself, because that is what's most important. Thank you. Hi, Reed.
Hey, Robert. Thank you so much, Robert. So you raised so many things in your talk just now. Mm-hmm. I think for me, one of the top things on my mind is, can you just explain very quickly for people what the science of HIV says now in terms of undetectable equals untransmittable, what HIV treatment can do to suppress viral load, and what that means for transmission?
Yeah, so I'm not the science person in the room, so I'll do my best to explain. Since the introduction of antiretroviral treatment, in the mid-90s, as I said earlier, it changed the landscape of the fact that people who thought they were dying are now being able to live longer lives. And so since that time, from 97, probably even before then, up to now, treatment has advanced tremendously, and just getting us closer and closer to the point that that if a person is on treatment, and they have like the virus is at certain levels in their body, and if they're on treatment, it brings the virus down, the viral load down. To the point we were able to detect the HIV in blood. But now with the way that the medicine is effective, it brings it down to 0 to the point where they can't even detect it. Now, the individual is still HIV positive, but they cannot detect it in the virus in the blood, which means that the person cannot transmit the virus to another individual if they're engaging in sex.
Thanks, Robert. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
no
So
problem.
I think it's very helpful just to give that as some background, because not everybody, so I'm living with HIV, you are, so sometimes we know some of these details that others might not know. In terms of on going over that again, so just to recap this, if somebody living with HIV is on medication and gets to a virally suppressed level, so under 200 copies per milliliter, and they're not able to sexually transmit HIV.
Right.
So if they were to have consensual sex, they're not able to sexually transmit HIV to that individual. Yet these state statutes are still on the books that treat any interaction with an HIV positive person as though it's a potential murder, right, of another individual. Right. So when these statutes came online in the early 90s mostly, there was that fear, that hysteria, lack of information.
Right.
And it has literally enshrined into law that HIV stigma that then added to oppressing people with HIV, people of color specifically, and people are facing these criminalization statutes. Potentially, yeah. So I thank you for really bringing that to light. So can you explain also what that means for where you see racial justice in the HIV movement and HIV activism and advocacy needing to be more of a focus?
Yeah, and I like to highlight the term racial justice because HIV, I'm originally from the South, and so in the South, the epidemic is so prevalent, and it's mostly prevalent among the Black community or the African American community. And so, in the sphere of talking about biomedical, research, a lot of it, it's good information, it's helping the community. However, the people that are suffering or sort of left out of this is the Black community due to all sorts of inequities, racial inequities, and having access to health care, and then also the barriers, in terms of the criminal justice system. And so there are barriers that are created where even, economic barriers where people don't have the resources that they need in order to, live productive and full lives. And so I highlight racial justice because it's so easy to talk about communities of people living with HIV, but we also need to look a little deeper at who actually is impacted and who's left out. And so if it's the Black people that are being impacted, Black people need to also be at the decision-making table. They need to be in leadership in order to make the best decisions that in regards to issues that impact them. And so what I'm seeing is that that's not happening as much, and we need to encourage more support around racial equity as well as racial justice within the HIV movement, as well, and even other movements broadly.
I know one of the kind of slogans from early HIV activism was people who are directly affected need to be part of the response. So in HIV criminalization, you as somebody who was directly affected really became a leader in that response. So what you're saying, I think, is also there need to be resources to make that possible, and really to, how do you see your own leadership as being kind of cultivated and helped along the way, as opposed to, did you just wake up one day and say, I need to do this, or were there kind of people along the way who helped you and supported you?
I would say at first I didn't want to be a leader because I didn't really know what that involved as far as speaking out, but really I've learned that it's just really about sharing your experience with people, and so I've sort of grown into that role. For me, I think coming into the community and connecting with other strong leaders, and not just men, but also women, living with HIV, been so inspired by the movement of the women's movement in terms of the HIV community and how they come together and how they speak out in regards to issues and doing work around comprehensive sexual reproductive rights and things like that. And so I've just tried to use my leadership as to support and inspire people and to help where I can. And do I feel like I've been supported? I think so. I mean, I've been able to connect with you as a friend and colleague through the years, and been people that I could lean on. And so, I've just not tried to make it about me and just really make it more about helping our community move forward, and just try to do my best to highlight things that need to be highlighted on platforms wherever I can.
Thanks, Robert. One of the questions that just came in online was, is it different speaking to different generations about HIV criminalization or your work in general?
Oh, it really is. For those who are long-term survivors and people who were much older. I'm 40, by the way. I know some that think I'm
very
younger.
young 40.
So yes, I have learned that it's a little different because they lived in a different time. They lived in a time where people were dying, literally dying, and I totally get that. And I was probably a little baby during those times. But nonetheless, the laws, what I say is that the laws don't change. They have not changed. And so no matter if you're a person living with HIV from back in the day to a newly diagnosed person today, no matter how you may have contracted HIV, those laws are still the same. They will be applied to each and every individual in the same manner. And for some people, depending on how they identify, because we all don't live single-issue lives, sometimes the punishment can be even greater. There are sentence enhancements if people are found to be injecting drug users or sex workers and living with HIV. And so it really affects a lot of us in ways that many people may not even be aware of. And so generationally speaking, there definitely have been differences.
I know the title of your talk was that this work is not a sprint but a marathon. Mm-hmm. What are the things that you think people in racial justice, social justice movements need to hear from individuals like yourself who are directly affected by an issue about support for the marathon, not the sprint?
Yeah, I would say, connect with people who are actually impacted by your cause. Do your best to connect them, gather them, empower them as leaders, let them speak. That is so important because when I came into the movement, the thing is that they've been talking about HIV criminalization. They just didn't have anybody to talk about it themselves. So in essence, I feel like the movement was looking for me, in a sense, even though I wasn't necessarily looking for them, but I'm glad that we were able to connect, and I'm really grateful for that. But I encourage other social movement leaders, connect with the people who are impacted. Do your work intersectionally. You get along further in that. We're learning how to do that, not just to be about HIV, but also to go broader in terms of other issues around racial justice, economic justice, reproductive rights, things like that. I did have another point, but I can't remember it right now. But those are the two. Those are the two that really stand out for me.
Thank you so much, Robert. So if we get your point later, we'll include it in the online conversation. Right. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you.
Thanks, Reed. Appreciate that. I'm going to take this. All right. Thanks, Robert. I appreciate it. All right. So you heard from me earlier that we have some of the largest social issues and movements and representation here today. I'm going to be sitting down with two of those leaders who are behind, especially digitally organizing and recruiting young Americans to be involved not only in the Green New Deal, but also in keeping families together, some of that biggest campaign on immigration right now. The first person I want to introduce is Arcely Jimenez Hudes. Come on out, Arcely. Thank you. Arcely is actually with the Sunrise Movement. Have you heard of the Green New Deal? All right. We had some fans in here, maybe. All right, my next one is Jess Morales Rocketo. Jess, come on out. Jess is with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, as well as behind the Families Belong Together campaign. Now, Jess, actually, I think some people may know you in a different way. How so?
Yep. Okay. So I have the esteemed honor to be the person that sent Hillary Clinton's text messages in 2016. So if you got a lot of text message from somebody who said, "Hey, it's Jess," that was me, and I'm not sorry. Not sorry.
How many times do people say to you, "Are you that Jess?"
It's less now, right? I mean, 2016 through early 2017, literally every time I met a person, and you know, we use text a lot. It was a really important part of our program, which means I text a lot of people very often. So they would also tell me things like, "You text me more than my boyfriend does." You know, like, I like woke up to your text. So I'm a little sorry for that part, but I wasn't sorry for sending them.
All right, so tell me about your current work right now. Obviously in immigration, Keep Families Together.
Yeah, I'm the co-chair of Families Belong Together. We are the people who did the big marches all around the country last summer, or 2018 summer, and the campaign to end family separation and detention. I feel extraordinarily lucky to do this work, and I also wish that we didn't have to do this work. What's happening at the border is a manufactured crisis by the Trump administration because of the zero tolerance policy that they put forward. And that means that they changed our immigration law to criminally prosecute every single person who came to present themselves at the border. That includes children, women, and it also includes people who are presenting themselves legally for asylum. Many, many people who are coming to the border are presenting themselves for asylum.
Got it. Now, Jess, was this I know that immigration has been something you're working on, but there's also some other issues that you're also behind?
Oh, yes. We do a lot of work at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So we represent 2.5 million domestic workers. That means nannies, elder care workers, housekeepers who work in people's homes. And one of the reasons that we're involved in Families Belong Together and that we started that is because many of the women that we represent are immigrants. Over 60% of them are immigrants. Many of those women are undocumented. So literally the people who are coming to the border are their family members, their children. We are working very hard to make the lives of domestic workers better, and also to make sure that those women are given the leadership and elevation that they deserve in our communities, because they really are the backbone of our economy.
Got it. Araceli, so they told me 22 years old, the digital organizer, getting all young Americans involved in the Sunrise Movement. How did you get even into that role? How did that happen?
Yeah, totally. It's true. I am 22. Yeah, so I grew up in Brooklyn in Sunset Park. And so, for those of you who don't know, Sunset Park is a predominantly immigrant, Hispanic, mostly working class community on Brooklyn's waterfront. And so growing up, I kind of saw firsthand the intersection between racial and economic inequality and the climate crisis. And I had so much anger inside of me, but I didn't know where to direct it until about a year and a half ago, when I was actually canvassed off the street by someone who was volunteering full-time for Sunrise. And I learned that there was a movement of young people working to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. And I myself became a full-time volunteer because I was so inspired by the stories I heard of young people all across the country, dropping out of school or delaying going to college, or delaying getting a full-time job to be full-time volunteers for this movement that eventually launched the Green New Deal. So I like to think I made the right choice by joining. And yeah, so before joining Sunrise, I had some background in student journalism, but yeah, the way I fell into this role is that really I found a community that trusted me and trusted that by virtue of my own lived experience, I was a leader. And I think that that's a really key thing to know about Sunrise Movement, is that we don't put a lot of emphasis or put a lot of stock in what degree do you have, what jobs have you had. It's are you willing to go all in on this work? If so, then we want you.
So there's a lot of people that define the Green New Deal in many different ways, sometimes depending on what side you are. How would you, for nobody that knows nothing about it, has been living underneath a rock for a little bit, no climate strike, all that other stuff, how do you define the Green New Deal?
Totally. Yeah. I always define the Green New Deal as our generation's last chance to secure our survival and the survival for generations to come on this planet. And that means recognizing that the climate crisis we're in is not a result of our individual choices, but it's actually the result of the greed of fossil fuel billionaires and CEOs and executives and corporate lobbyists and corporate PACs who have bought out our democracy for decades and have sowed doubt and division about the climate crisis. And so the Green New Deal is specifically about addressing those big structural, about addressing structural changes that need to happen if we're actually going to address the climate crisis at the scale that the most recent science reports demand.
Yeah, and when you're going out and organizing, and Jess, this is also to you as well. Why do some people not, when you're out there and talking about the stories or highlighting youth that are a part of it, there's got to be some youth that also don't agree and are not all in it. Somebody will often ask me, hey, I look into your research and I notice there's a lot of potential liberal-style causes and issues if they were to frame it that way. But I heard the arguments, obviously, that the Green New Deal is not. It is a bipartisan potential efforts and so on. But how do you talk to maybe the movable middle or those that are not already in? I'd love to hear your viewpoint, and Jess, same.
Yeah, totally. I can go first. So I think a lot of that has to do with, a couple of things. First thing is that for decades, I think that we as a country have been told a lie that we just don't deserve basic human rights, right? Like our economic system, our society is set up to tell us that we need to pay for basic human rights like healthcare and a home and our water. And so that's one piece, is that for decades people have just been told that we just don't deserve these things when the reality is that actually we do. And then the second thing is that I think that the climate movement of the past, which obviously incredible work, and we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do today if the groundwork hadn't been laid by the climate movement of the past. But I do think that the mainstream, mostly white climate movement of the past failed to really talk about the crisis holistically. And so, for example, as we're talking about solutions to the climate crisis, like a Green New Deal, we understand that a Green New Deal actually won't do any good if we don't also have a solution to address immigration and the crisis at the border. A Green New Deal doesn't mean much if we don't have a federal jobs guarantee, if we don't tie it into decarceration. And so I think a big project for Sunrise moving forward, and for the entire social left social movements moving forward, is to really expand our issues and making sure that as many people as possible can see themselves reflected in our work and our message.
Jess?
Yeah, I mean, Families Belong Together, what we are actually trying to do is specifically get to that movable middle. That's the kind of number one thing that we're doing. If you have been paying attention to the immigrants' rights movement, and you probably have not, which is totally fine, for the last decade, there's an extremely vibrant immigrants' rights movement led by immigrants and undocumented people themselves. I mean, in some ways, if you look at the Dreamer movement, they have actually paved the way for many other types of organizing that are happening in this country. So we didn't feel like we needed to organize those people. They're being actually amazingly organized and have made many, many wins, and are incredible leaders. What we felt like is to get what we wanted around immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, or just not a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment in America, right? Or to end family detention, which is something that's gonna take a lot of work. We actually needed to get more than immigrants activated around this. We needed non-immigrant people to really see themselves as protagonists in this work. And that doesn't mean, and I think sometimes that makes people get squishy because they think it means don't listen to immigrants. It does not mean that. It means still center impacted people and their leadership, and also give allies something very, very meaningful to do. For us, that can sometimes be donations, I think is one of the easiest things, but it's also like, do you want to get supplies? Do you want to volunteer? We've had artists make things, we've had exhibits for the artists have made that have been on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on the lawn. All of those things we felt like did something that was really important, which is we gave an entryway into the immigrants' rights movement, which is tough because immigration is really complicated. And it can feel really scary to get into something that you don't know a lot about, that you might say the wrong thing about, that also maybe feels like it's controversial. So what we wanted to do is say, you don't have to know everything. If you believe that families belong together, you're welcome here. When you get here, there'll be some stuff for you to do that is meaningful, that makes you feel clear about the impact that you have made. And also, I think this part actually has been really important. As an organizer, I think about my job as being like a motivator for people, about creating motivation over and over again, but also about giving people that first spark that makes you want to do something. That person who made Araceli want to go volunteer full time, that's a really good organizer because that requires a lot of motivation. What we wanted to do with Families Belong Together, and in particular in the face of this crisis where we heard all the time, I feel so helpless, I feel so helpless, I feel so helpless. How are we creating a motivating moment and many, many motivating moments to make you feel like maybe we haven't fixed this yet, and we haven't. We've done some good things, but we haven't fixed it yet. But how do we make you realize that you're not helpless? And to us, that's really important for immigrants' rights, but it's also really important for this moment that we're in our country right now.
Yeah. So there are a lot, you mentioned a little bit of this, that there are some movements in the past, right, that were either led or had their viewpoints on things. Jess, with you, in terms of some of the older movements, what honestly was their first reaction to your work, and then how are you either working with them now or not?
Yeah, Families Belong Together is a coalition of over 200 groups, and I sometimes think I'm a genius for that, and then also I'm you're an idiot for that.
We've all been there.
We're working in coalition in a big, super broad coalition that spans the gamut of people who are abolish ICE, and then people who are I literally just got here yesterday, and I don't really know anything except I don't believe babies belong in cages, is whew, there's a lot of emotional intelligence, I feel, that is involved with that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that we have relentlessly stuck to with Families Belong Together that has helped is we try to stay around values-based positive messaging. So that's why it's Families Belong Together and not end family detention. Not because we don't want to end family detention, that is the literal goal of our campaign, but because we want people to understand what we are for. And I think that's really hard sometimes because it's easy to know what you're against, and it's a lot harder to talk about something that hasn't happened yet. And the minute that messaging started working, I mean, truly, the minute it started really gaining traction, all around the world, people were great, let's change the message.
Yeah. You're good, we're successful removing this.
Totally, and now we can move on to something else, and it's...
And everybody's in charge of marketing.
Correct. And so it has been actually a real struggle to keep people around the Families Belong Together frame, which is also kind of blows my mind. It's this is literally the most successful thing that we've had in a really long time. Why would we change it? But I think that has been a really big thing. The other thing was which I referenced earlier is when we talked about we wanted to engage non-immigrants, people got kind of scared about that because it is true that past movements have said that they were engaging everyone and that has left marginalized communities behind. One amazing thing about working at the National Domestic Workers Alliance is we are the vulnerable communities that many people are talking about, and we're the ones who are leading it. It's all women of color that lead Families Belong Together and that have led Families Belong Together and that founded Families Belong Together. And I think that that's really helpful. I was on another panel like this, and they asked me, why do you think the coalition worked? And I was well, there weren't any men. And and we actually do have a number of awesome male leadership now in the coalition, but at the very beginning, it was 4 women that kind of came together. And I actually do think that was really important because we instilled this idea of collaboration, of holding many truths at once, of being positive and values focused, of being emotional. It's a very emotional campaign. It's really rooted in culture and art, and I think all those things were really helpful in its success and are also some of the things that make people the most squirmy about it.
Yeah. How did you mentioned some of the older movements in climate. I mean, how did they take it when you came on this? Because you came on in pretty good force. Obviously, you had some backing of certain legislator that was helping launch the Green New Deal. But I mean, how did they take to it, and how are you working with them now?
Totally, yeah. Just to clarify for the audience about the moment that we're talking about is a little less than a year ago.
Feels so long ago.
Yeah, for real. A little less than a year ago. The Democrats, it was a pretty good chance that we were going to win the House, and then an article came out in The Hill that said that Democratic leadership was not going to put climate on the agenda for this session for this Congress, and Sunrise and a lot of other young people across the country were pretty mad about that. So the week after the election, we went down to D.C., sat in at Nancy Pelosi's office, and the newly elected, Congresswoman-elect at the time, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, joined us and put down a resolution for a select committee on the Green New Deal. So part of my work in Sunrise is digital, and at that time I was managing all of our social media accounts, so I was on Twitter all day, and so the reactions were pretty mixed. I think there's definitely a lot of excitement, but I think a lot of the old guard folks saw young people just so radically shift the conversation. And I'll say that it's tough when you've been in this work for probably most of your life, decades. You've been trying to get climate legislation like cap and trade passed, and then it dies, and then you have to wait until you win back governing power, and then a bunch of 18, 20-year-olds come in and slap a 14-page document on the table, and suddenly climate politics in America has changed forever. I can imagine their frustration. But I think Sunrise, our founders did deep study of past social movements, not just the climate movement, but social movements across this country and across the world. And we knew that if we were going to win solutions at the scale of the crisis, we couldn't advocate for piecemeal things or things that were just short of what we needed. We need to actually go big and demand things that were backed up by science. And at that time, about a year ago, it was a few weeks after the most recent UN climate report had come out that told us we had 12 years left to address the climate crisis.
Yeah. So are you working with some of them now? Some of the older guard organizations who have been working on this?
We're in some coalition building, both with organizations and or movements that have been around for a while, and we're also working or hoping to be in coalition with other youth movements that aren't just in the climate movement, but in the immigrants' rights movements, decarceration movements, et cetera.
That are connected. So, we have to get to some questions online because there is a lot coming. So the first one is what happens, how do you maintain interest, awareness, activity when there's not these crisis moments?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that. This is my number one, I think this is people's number one myth about social movements, that it all stays up on the day where you have 700 rallies. And it just first of all, I would be so tired if every single day I had to keep it all the way up to 700 rally level. That's not possible. But when you study social movements, you learn about kind of peaks and valleys. And what I always think about is how am I creating peaks, and also how am I recognizing when we're in a valley and we need to create a peak. And that is how people's lives work. And so that's how social movements work, because what you're doing is organizing people. For us, that means if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready, and so you're always trying to create the circumstances so that when your moment comes, you can really take advantage of it, which is what happened with family separation in the first place. Literally, I was on vacation. It was the first vacation I'd taken in my whole life that was that long. My little sister was graduating from college overseas. I went to go see her, and so it gave me enough perspective to be away that when I looked at Twitter and I was seeing stuff happen, I called my boss and I was look, I don't come back for another week, but you got to organize some rallies like immediately. There's a thing happening around family separation, and if we don't do this now, we're gonna miss the moment. And to her credit, she was like, okay. And
Yeah.
that was the first set of actions that we did around family separation. The first week it was 15, and then the next week it was 30, and then the next week it was 80, and then the next week it was 776 around the country, and actually the world.
Wow.
So I think that's the other like really important thing is like you build. People feel like, and then hundreds of rallies happened around the country. Like, no.
Yeah.
That's just like not how it happens
Yeah.
at all. And then, I'm really proud to say that since the summer of 2018 when we started doing this work, family separation has never been out of the news. And in fact, we've had multiple sort of humongous media moments. And that has enabled us to make family separation and family detention and being against those things actually at the core of the platforms of all the Democratic Party presidential candidates. We didn't have to call them and say, you should talk about this. They just talked about it on their own. And that stuff didn't just happen. It's because they were responding to what is the pressure that is existing in the world and also what they want to align themselves with so that they can say, these are my values. And to me, that's really important because then there's something happening there that has nothing to do with us. Families Belong Together isn't telling them to do any of that stuff. They're carrying our message for us because it was so resonant.
Yeah. How about you? What urgency? Obviously, you had that big moment we just talked about, but how have you maintained interest, especially given what's going on right now in politics?
Yeah, totally. So Sunrise Movement, like we also orient our base towards direct action and mobilizing people to take direct action, whether it's escalated and people risk arrest or not. And so unfortunately, with the climate crisis getting worse and worse every day, there's actually like moments of the climate crisis every single day. Like there have been like 2 huge wildfires in California in 1 month. There's one raging right now. We've had hurricanes and floods like devastate the Midwest, farms that are still underwater and will probably never recover. And so we've really tried to mobilize and train our base to mobilize around those moments and politicize them. And, we're orienting our movement to an era of mass noncompliance. And, part of our plans for 2020 is to really go hard on the youth climate strikes and to actually, expand them, so it's not just youth, but it's also laborers and, workers joining in strikes. And, making it clear that business as usual cannot go on unless the climate crisis is addressed at the scale that we need. And so, yeah. That's what we're doing. I think just put it perfectly is that you have to build a drumbeat, and the drumbeat has to be building to a vision where millions of people are taking action in the streets consistently. Because when we look back at the history of this country and we look at what we were able to win in the era of the New Deal, FDR didn't just wake up one morning and say, yeah, let's give everyone Social Security. Workers were striking by the tens of thousands across an entire decade. And that's the scale of mobilization and energy that we need to win.
All right, so I have to ask the question about politics because it's the number one right now as well. So let's stay on the topic a little bit. How do you take actual politics, though, out of this conversation? And can you, given what's going on, because there's some, there's the questions around how do we take politics and partisanship out of these amazing movements?
Yeah, I think that's it's a little bit about audience. So I do want to be clear. Family separation happened because of a Trump administration policy. So it was political before it started. And I think that's really important. At the same time, it's one of the things that we learned during this process, which we knew, but we have lots of data around, is that even among people who align themselves with the opposite of the Trump administration, immigration is not necessarily a motivating issue for them, and their feelings about immigrants may not be positive. So actually, one of the things that really guides us is thinking about as broad an audience as possible. And I think that's actually really important. When we're doing an art exhibit in San Diego, because the judge of the San Diego court is deciding whether or not we can add more families to the family separation lawsuit that is helping us reunite families, we're not talking about politics. It's literally an art exhibit we have these really cool statues of a woman and a child, and we create this entire exhibit around it that is incredibly moving. We don't really talk about the politics of it, but we can't escape the politics of it when it is a reaction to a political policy and a political movement. But that is why we talk about families belong together and not something else, and also not just the Trump administration, because our campaign is to end family separation and end family detention, and that's going to go beyond one administration or one politician.
Politics out of it? Can you? How?
I think, I guess our approach has been to really look carefully at how we have gotten into this crisis and what the role of government in getting us into this crisis. And the fact is that while the Republican Party elites have definitely been the lead climate deniers for the past few decades, let's be real, the Democratic establishment didn't exactly do much to put them in check. They've also been taking hundreds of thousands, some of them even millions of dollars from the same fossil fuel billionaires, the same CEOs, the same lobbyists, the same PACs. When you take money from the same people, then your interests are the same. And so, that's why Sunrise is going hard on primaries, where we have folks running against those Democrats that have taken that money, folks who are primarying these bought out politicians running on a Green New Deal and showing that a Green New Deal can win.
All right, so staying with you, because this is the next one. Are you ready? Some say the Green New Deal would have a higher chance of success if it prioritized policies that directly would reduce emissions. Pragmatically, why cast the net so wide?
I think that, this actually calls back to, I think, a mistake that the past climate movement made, which was they made the crisis about parts per million and polar bears. This crisis is not about parts per million and polar bears. It's about people. It's about our survival. And folks aren't going to be moved to go to the polls and turn out by the millions to vote for a Green New Deal if they're voting for the survival of some abstract figure. They're going to vote for themselves. They're going to vote for their families. They're going to vote for their father who died of cancer because they were poisoned by a chemical plant that is 30 feet away from their house. That's why people are going to vote.
Okay. Well, let's stay on voting. 2020, what are you working for? I mean, obviously, I conceptually get an idea of what you're working on, but give us a sense of 2020 for you.
Yeah, I think two huge things. One is we want to see as many women of color turn out to vote as ever have in this country. We believe, yes. One, we believe that's possible. That's so doable. I think we should be more ambitious than that. And two is, I do think we want to see a new president on day one reverse all of the Trump administration's, literally every single one of their immigration policies. If we do not have a president who does that, we will be trying to catch up for probably the next 50 years. So day one, all of them reversed.
2020, Sunrise?
Continue to build the urgency around the climate crisis, and also broadening the vision of the Green New Deal so that as many people as possible can see themselves in that vision of a world that actually gives everyone the right to a good job and a livable future.
Thank you. Thank you both. Let's give them a round of All right. Well, what's interesting is I'm gonna stay on stage because two colleagues and friends of mine turned 10, not themselves, but actually the movement that they've been behind. And that movement is Global Citizen. Global Citizen this year has been in sort of reality for around a decade right now. And both Simon and Wei have been one of the co-founders behind the movement. And in fact, they actually have a documentary that came out on them, which is called Activate. And we're going to show a little bit of that right now. Thank you. Simon, Wei, come on out. How are you? Well, so for those that may not know Global Citizen, I can't believe by now that you guys have a little bit of a concert thing going on every year, not that far from here. But Simon, start out and give us a sense of Global Citizen. What is Global Citizen?
So Global Citizen's a movement of people from all around the world who want to see an end to extreme poverty and tackle climate change. And what our work is all about is connecting the worlds of pop culture and the worlds of policy to make sure that we can mobilize millions and millions of people around the world to get up there and make the change that all your research says they so desperately want to see but so often don't know how to help create.
Wei, give us a sense. Now, you were in charge of growth, new markets, all of those things. in the 10 years, what have you learned specifically, especially around Global Citizen?
I think particularly on the theme of this summit as well, that really what Global Citizen about is about global change management, that all politics is local, that in order to make change, you need to affect the mindsets of citizens, whether they be in government, in politics, in business, in general public. And really in that sense, when you look at any extreme poverty, it's not going to be ended by Americans or Australians or Europeans. It has to be very grassroots led in terms of Nigerians in Nigeria and Indians in India and Indonesians in Indonesia. That fundamentally what we've managed to be doing the last 10 years at Global Citizen is to create a methodology which holds a society and each other to account. So as part of the movement, it's based upon 3 pillars of content, action, rewards, that you consume content, you do online actions, and for the chance to, again, get a reward. So as Simon mentioned, we have this festival in Central Park, but in order to go to that event each year, you have to take these action journeys. And once you've done those steps, you can then have a chance to go to the festival. Now, 2016 was the first time we managed to take this methodology to outside of the global north. So we took it to India for the first time, and then we took it to South Africa in last year, and that was on the back of the 100th year anniversary of Mandela's centenary. And then next year, taking it to Lagos, Nigeria, which is the epicenter and ground zero for extreme poverty worldwide. So I think it's been exciting that after 10 years of developing a methodology, now overlaying it into places where locals can hold each other to account.
Yeah. So we just had Jas Arceley on here. They probably think you're a little older of a movement than them, even though you're only 10 years old.
I certainly feel it.
Yeah. But Simon, kind of give me the 1 or 2 big things you've learned in 10 years doing this. Because first you should tell everybody how many people have been involved in Global Citizen. How big is the movement globally?
So Global Citizen does anywhere from 20 to 30 million engagements a month across all the platforms and things that we do. We have a couple of 100,000 people show up in person at our events each year. We mobilize anywhere from sort of $5 to $10 billion a year in commitments to achieve the global goals. So we're often working on some of the very big topics that are out there with quite large numbers of people, some of whom are engaged in quite small ways, some of whom are giving their lives and everything to this. And so as I look at what I've learned, I think the first thing is that people are yearning for a sense of what positive change they can be a part of. People want to know that, 1, their voice matters, 2, that they can make a difference, and that they're a part of a community of others who want to do it, and that they don't need to give their everything. And I think you heard that from some of the folks already, that not everyone is going to be an activist who can dedicate their lives to this. I know much of your research has found this. What we need to do is break it into bite-sized chunks that together can ladder up to something big. In our universe, that's about advocacy and political pressure on world leaders and philanthropists and big businesses. But equally as much, we saw an example about how do you change, say, one specific policy that might have nothing to do with money, like keeping families together, as you were just hearing. So I think that's the first lesson is how do you build a sense of community? How do you build that sense of identity? And for us, not so secret, totally public thing that most people don't know is the legal entity name of our organisation is Global Poverty Project. We were set up because we care about as a mission fighting poverty, and Al Gore's thing was the Climate Project, and I needed to write a name on a form to try and get some money in the door when we were first starting. And we're known as Global Citizen because that's who we are rather than what the bank account once said. And I think for us that's an important part of how we see all of this, that ultimately it's about people.
Yeah. Wait, talk a little bit about the points incentivized system in a way. Do you categorize it as incentive-based?
Well, we refer to it as gamified advocacy.
Okay.
And really, Simon touched about this. If you break down what are we trying to do at Global Citizen, it's popular culture meets public policy. How do you take these very important public policy issues, which are often on the sidelines and margins, and to make it become dinner table conversation? And we talked about, we've found through the years that I would refer to our artist celebrities as our distribution channels. That's how we revolve ourselves around. That's how we get our information from. That's That's what we get excited about. And then through these distribution channels, you can now reach into audience members who can learn about these issues. So you hear there's some fancy thing in Central Park with Jay-Z or Beyonce or Coldplay. Oh, but now I have to jump to these hoops to get there. So really, yes, it's incentives, but really it's about how do you make it part of everyday life so that it becomes cool, becomes sexy, becomes a part of who we are. And it's tapping to existing infrastructure, and that really happens all around us in terms of popular culture. So aside from the festival, there's also the ticket system, where we have partnerships with through Ticketmaster and groups around the world where we get tickets through each of their shows throughout the world. So they could be, for example, Shawn Mendes performing in Philadelphia, and then now you can use up your points which you've earned to then have a chance to go to that show. And really it's a constant engagement and a constant thinking about who are you, who am I in this world, what do I want the world to be, and I can have the chance to be rewarded for doing good.
Yeah.
I want to just add something to that. A couple of years ago, and I'm sorry if I bastardize your research findings, I remember one of the bits that you came out with was that lots of people identified as active or activist, but weren't necessarily behaving in that way.
Yeah.
And we know from the focus groups we do and when we talk to our audience, if you ask them, like, do you believe in fairness and equality and all these values, they say yes. Then you say, what have you done? And people scratch their heads a little bit. And then you say, will you do this thing? And they say yes, and then you watch them.
And then they lie sometimes.
And then they don't do it. And then you say, and look, here's a little bit of a carrot. And what we're seeing is that people's attitudes don't change, people's behaviours change. And that in particular, you can get people who are doing a little bit to do a little bit more, and people who are doing nothing to do something. And I think that in our democracy, that's such an important conversation. We heard the comment before. We need millions more young people getting out there and voting next year. I honestly do not care who they vote for, but if you're not exercising a democratic right at the ballot box and all throughout society all year round, we're missing a trick, and we're not going to be creating the sort of society that everyone is telling us in your research that they want to create. So for us, it's how do you bridge that gap between attitude and desire and real lived experience.
Yeah. And Wei, you mentioned that there's some work being done in the Global South. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
So since 2016, Global Citizen expanded to India, to South Africa, and also going to Nigeria next year. So we worked with a partnership with an NGO in India, and where we put on the event together. And then in South Africa, we've set up our own operations there as well. And Nigeria is going to be very exciting for a number of reasons. One is that it is the ground zero of the SDGs, that if you're not going to be able to affect change within Nigeria, the world will not be able to get anywhere close to an extreme poverty by 2030. And particularly too, it's when you are engaging with young people who are such a big proportion of those countries, and these are literally the future leaders of the country in a much bigger way than, say, in the global north is, plus also you're overlaying that with a large rising number of middle-class consumers too. I think the potential there is very exciting.
Yeah. Simon, talk about where are you headed now? It's been a decade-ish of this work. Are you going to be in it for another decade? I mean, what's the...
The world's got 10 years to stop climate change from undoing all the good progress that's been made over the last 25 years. The world's got a plan. The UN, all the world's countries came up with it in 2015. They're called the Global Goals for Sustainable Development. And for us, that's a really great roadmap. And we can get away from the discussions of is it possible, and say, guys, the world has a plan. What we need to do is mobilise the resources, the policy change to do it. So I'd love to be able to say in 2030, I'm done, I'm retired. I look forward already to seeing these young people, the folks you're hearing from today, who are rising up, who are doing such amazing work. I think for me that the overwhelming thing that I'm seeing right now is that, and you saw this in your research, that these issues connect lots, and you can't tackle poverty without tackling climate change. You can't talk about how to make the world better without directly addressing issues like gender equality as part of that, and making sure that at the heart of the storytelling that we do, the heart of the actions that we're taking, we're reflecting that in what we do. I think to me is a big shift from someone who 15 years ago stood up at a rather public event and said, I don't give a shit about polar bears. I care about people. And I still care a lot more about people than polar bears, but I recognise that the polar bear is an incredibly important symbol of what we're doing to our planet and all the people who live on it.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Go ahead. They'll take that for you. All right, we've got 2 more issues briefly to come through, so stay with me because we do have some trivia later on. There's some great Levi's cards you could win, so hang in there. Our next issue that we're going to be discussing is mental health. As I started out at the top of this discussion, I said that mental health as a topic and a social issue has been top of minds of a lot of young people as well. I want to bring out John, who's with the JED Foundation, John McPhee. John and his crew at the JED Foundation have been instrumental in trying to open up conversations with young people around mental health. He is going to lead a panel discussion as well to talk about how do we communicate this important issue. John. Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Derek. It's my pleasure to be here and to introduce our panelists, starting with Amanda Chan. Amanda is Director of Content Strategy at Bustle Digital Group, one of the world's fastest growing publishers in modern media. Working with creators, BDG uncovers issues and stories that matter through the lenses of authenticity, inclusivity, and conversation. The result is the largest audience of any female-focused digital media company and the greatest reach of any millennial-focused site. Amanda oversees every company vertical: lifestyle, entertainment, beauty, fashion, books, news, and politics. Welcome, Amanda. And now to introduce Lena Renzina. Lena leads Creators for Good, the Ad Council's talent engagement program, which matches traditional and digital talent with the organization's purpose-driven marketing initiatives. Working with talent, these partnerships have reached millions to drive impact surrounding such important causes as suicide prevention, breast cancer risk awareness, and diversity and inclusion. Lena has spoken at industry events such as South by Southwest, VidCon, and Social Media Week. Her background in theatrical producing, marketing, and talent management is a testament to her passion for the arts, authentically reaching audiences through digital storytelling. All right, so welcome to both of you. I'm going to start by just sort of setting the stage about mental health and really focusing on young adult mental health. The first thing I'd like us to do is to think about what is mental health. I mean, what do we mean when we say mental health? And I'll direct us to the World Health Organization, which I think actually has a very good definition. The World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of well-being in which we know our capabilities, we're able to cope with life's normal stressors, and we can contribute to our communities productively and fruitfully in the ways that we want. And so I think it's a nice definition, right? Because it's not the absence of mental illness; it's a state of well-being. And so if we think then or ask ourselves, what does it mean not to have mental health, and what does it mean not to have this a state of well-being? One answer to that, and it's a big part of it, is if we are experiencing a mental illness, as many people do. So we're talking about depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, etc. Which, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, 1 in 5 Americans are experiencing at any time. Okay. In addition, though, to not be in a state of well-being also includes states in which we're not flourishing, right? Where we're just sort of getting by, we're surviving and in survival mode. So when we put those two things together, we're talking about a tremendous number of people. To talk for a minute now about the statistics, how many people are we actually talking about? Well, as I just referenced, we're talking about 1 in 5 overall people are every year experience a mental illness. But if we look specifically at young adults who are 18 to 25, that number has now reached 26%. It's 1 in 4 who are experiencing a mental illness every year. And really, heartbreakingly, more than half are receiving no care at all. Okay? And they're receiving no care in large part because they don't actually know what's wrong, they haven't been noticed, but also because we have structural access to care problems here in the U.S. Depression is the biggest piece of that, depression and anxiety. Depression alone, 14% of people between the ages of 12 and 25 last year had a major depressive episode, at least one major depressive episode. So when we think about all the people that are in that age group, we're talking about something like 7 million people last year, teens and young adults, experienced a major depressive episode. Now, that statistic in 2018 is 70% higher than the number of teens and young adults who experienced a major depressive episode in 2011. So the rates are rising very, very quickly, not just for depression, but for anxiety, for suicidal ideation, for suicidal behavior, and even for suicide. We're seeing really large growth rates. I will, though, just take a minute to put this in context. The rates, and as they're rising and as high and disturbing as that is today, they are still below the rates they were, and I'm specifically talking about suicide, in the 1970s and 80s. But what we saw in the 90s coming into sort of 2001 was a real drop. And now they've been rising, and now they're rising again fast. And the question is, what can we do? And we'll talk about it to bring them back down. The reasons are many. You know, the world today is very stressful. Young people are facing unreasonable expectations and comparisons, often putting them on themselves. The world feels very unstable. It's frenetic. The news is coming at us very, very fast, including extremely stressful and upsetting things such as school shootings, incivility, racism, prejudice, and this sense that young people have today that they're going to succeed or fail, that the result is binary, that there isn't a lot of range. And I myself believe that's directly tied to rising income inequality. And what makes some of this so difficult in this work is that there's truth behind some of these challenges, right? This isn't like it's made up. These stressors are real. We're also seeing some real changes, such as today's young people are more sleep deprived than any previous generation. They spend less time outside than any previous generation. They're carrying more debt than previous generations, right? So there are real challenges. What do we need? Well, we need more conversations about mental health. We need people to feel more comfortable about seeking help, and we all need to be part of a culture of caring where we are checking in with others, asking them if they're okay. We're help giving. In the mental health space, we talk a lot about help seeking. Help giving is critical. And this is especially important that we bind together as a community because there just are, as I referenced, real serious structural issues. We don't have enough behavioral health care workers. We don't have enough clinics. If you're fortunate enough to be able to get access to somebody, a mental health clinician, there's a good chance they're not going to be somebody that's going to understand your problems or that you're going to identify with. And none of that even gets into the challenges around, can you afford it? You know? So real major structural issues. But what I want to say is that there is good news, because I feel like that was just a whole bunch of bad news to set the stage. But there is actually some very good news, and that is that today's youth are the most culturally accepting generation, and they really do want to talk about mental health, and they are talking about mental health. And in fact, I think for those of us who are older, I'm 52 and I have a 23-year-old daughter and a 25-year-old daughter, we have to make sure we're not bringing our legacy stigma to the table, because younger people really are not carrying the same kind of stigma. There are still barriers, challenges about that are preventing help seeking and help giving, but it's better than it used to be. And research shows that young people want to help their friends, and we know that they turn to their friends first when they're struggling. So I do think there's an opportunity here for youth to lead the way in mental health and take us into the future. So with that, let's get into this discussion and some questions. So Amanda, let's start with you. What role does the media play in encouraging people to seek help for mental health issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously the media is something that we all have on our phones, on our TVs, on our computers. We're always plugged in these days, so it's very influential. It's very, it's everywhere, right? So as a member of the media, we don't take that lightly in terms of, understanding the impacts and the influence that we have on all age groups, honestly, but especially young people, especially for where I work at Bustle Digital Group. So, we understand that people come to us not just or that it's important to provide content that's productive, not just that's like straight up health content that's very clearly servicey, but also just acknowledging that there's a opportunity to destigmatize and to open up the conversation around mental health in any kind of article or thing that you're covering. So even if it's a TV show, even if it's a movie or something, if there's an opportunity to have a productive conversation from it and to kind of pick something from there that like, hey, this is really important actually. This is what that director was trying to make a point about with this therapy scene or something. Like, let's talk about that. Let's do a whole article about it. That's like really important to our mission, and I think is increasingly important to other publications as well, which is great, I think. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Lena, how have you found the right talent to work with, in this work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of what you've said about like the peer-to-peer is so important. And then as we found with talent, influencers, digital creators, they have this really intimate connection with their audiences. Their audiences feel like they're sort of a friend to them. They're creating this access. They're constantly talking to them. There's even like this new tool where you can now text your favorite celebrity. And so they have this intimate connection with them. It's really been about having, using their platforms and leveraging their talents to tell their stories about mental health. And from that, we really want to find the authentic connection to the issue. So through Seize the Awkward, which is our suicide prevention campaign, which Ed Foundation and AFSP, really focusing on 16 to 25-year-olds and that upstream messaging of mental health awareness, breaking down the stigma, starting those conversations, encouraging young adults to talk about mental health with their friends and also acknowledge when their friends are struggling. And we've done a lot of work with talent, creators, and musicians for that campaign. Music has been a really big part of the campaign this year because I think we found it was such a universal language for a lot of the young people we were trying to speak to. And we wanted to tap into the cultural zeitgeist, the moment where the talent was really popular and they had all the spotlight on them and they used it for good. And they used it for this amazing moment to tell their story and to reach out to their audience to start conversations about mental health. So really going back to the question, it's about the authentic connection. A lot of the artists that we worked with this year had a story they wanted to tell. They wanted to talk about mental health with their audiences, and we helped them do that responsibly and sensitively on their channels, because as with media too, there's that responsibility of doing it the right way. And we want to make sure that they know how to talk to their audiences and provide them the resources to be able to help their friends or to see signs when their friends are struggling. I think we have a video from one of our really high-profile partnerships this year talking about mental health with Billie Eilish.
The main thing I'm trying to say is that you have to listen. Starting that conversation, you don't have to make it super serious right away. You say, how are you feeling? Like, are you okay? That's what, say, are you okay? Ask somebody. That's what they, and yeah, I'm good. Really? Are you actually good? It's been like that for me. There have been certain people that have texted me right when I needed to be texted, saying they loved me and that they were thinking about me. And sometimes you don't even have to say anything to someone. Sometimes it's about a hug. Obviously, I am not a trained professional in anything. I don't know what I'm doing, but I have seen it, and I've been it, and it really means a lot.
It's really great. Amanda, let's talk about ways the media can be responsible in their mental health coverage.
Yeah. Again, like I said, we don't take it lightly that, people read us and we want them, we want to be responsible through that. So it's honestly a lot of just making sure that we take that burden upon ourselves as journalists and as editors to make sure that we are not perpetuating stigma, that we are being productive in everything that we do. And that involves a lot of consultations with nonprofits, with organizations, making sure that we are using as inclusive language as possible, as destigmatizing language as possible, including that we have the most recent up-to-date, boilerplates at the end if you need help or resources, including the crisis text line, for instance, or the suicide prevention hotline. We do regular consultations with these nonprofits to, a couple times a year just to make sure that we're doing everything right and being as responsible as possible. And in addition, even if there is a big, news event, so say, a celebrity takes their own life or something like that, and we know that we have to cover it, but we want to do it in a way that's responsible, but, we'll actually meet and have a meeting and talk about the right way to do it. So that's something that, for instance, we do, and I think and I hope other newsrooms are doing that as well, but that's just one thing.
Yeah, incredibly important. Lena, what's been the recipe and I guess the ingredients for the most successful partnerships with talents and influencers?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of them are in our amazing Seize the Awkward campaign, and we've really been privileged to work with some of the most amazing artists and creators and celebrities. And I think the secret sauce is really making sure that the creative speaks to the talent. Whether we're asking the talent to make something on their channel without our resources, or we're producing something like we did with Billie, it was really authentic to her and making sure the talent has a voice in what the creative is. And I think partnership is really important too. So even that word of, does the talent feel like they have a say in what's happening and how they're being portrayed and what the partnership is going to look like and how it's going to launch and when, and they really want to feel like you're sort of in there with them and that you're considering everything that's happening for them publicly and leveraging moments in time that they have a song being released or an album. I know that it was really important to some of our artists to include their songs that talked about mental health in the creative. So really trying to find the sort of 360 ways that we can feel like the partnership is mutually beneficial for both parties.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Thinking about those that do want to promote mental health, influencers and creators, do you have any advice for them, in terms of how to approach that and what calls to action, they should be aiming for with their audiences?
I'll go first. So advice, right?
Yeah.
So think first about what is needed, right? Like what is it that you are, what is the resource that's not out there? What is it that people are having trouble trying to wrap their mind around, or what is the barrier to getting that help that they need? Like what is that? Once you identify that, then you kind of know what to do, right? You know kind of who to ask for help or who is doing a good job of that and who is not, and you can kind of go from there. So again, I would emphasize the doing your homework and really trying to research what the responsible way of going about whatever message it is that you're trying to share is, because your words have so much power and your influence is so much power. So that's obviously going to be step one, no matter what.
Yeah, I think responsibility is a lot of it. Doing your research, talking to nonprofits in the space, going to seizetheawkward.org for those tips. But also, I think last year we sort of saw what was happening on the internet. Some creators that were sharing irresponsible content, and we saw that as an opportunity to bring together talent and influencers who cared about the issue, wanted to talk about it, but maybe didn't know how to do it and wanted to do it the right way. So we actually had an amazing event last October, a mental health summit with creators to give them the tools to talk about mental health with their audience, because it is so personal. It is a lot about sharing their stories, their struggles, how they're going through their work. A lot of them are experiencing burnout just because of the really high, intense pressure and standards that are put upon them. And so even having them talk about it and talk about burnout with their audiences and how they're navigating that has been so beneficial, and all of the responses and feedback they get. And then I think just even the simple things of how do you start a conversation about mental health and how do you see that your friend is struggling? So really arming yourself, if you're a creator, with the tools to talk about it the right way with your audience, of course through the lens of your own personal story or journey, whether you or a friend has been impacted.
That's great, thank you. So I have to throw a question out, I guess, to the organizers just to see if, I'm not sure how to check for audience questions. But as we just do that, or if I get help on for that, could we unpack that just a little bit more in terms of advice specifically, and this is what Seize the Awkward is about, for those situations where you are concerned about somebody else? Really, how do you approach that kind of a discussion?
I mean, I was actually at that summit last
Yeah.
year, and it was awesome. It was fantastic, and we did a piece for Bustle that was kind of like how to broach
Right,
that
that's right,
conversation with your
yes.
friends. And it's really a matter of listening and being like, I'm here for you, and I'm here to listen, and I'm there. And it's not about casting judgment or trying to solve the problem or anything like that. I think I talked to at least 5 or 6 people at that event, people who did really want to make it a priority to share their stories on their channels, but do it again in a productive, responsible way. And every single one of them, that was their number one advice, is like, just be there for that person.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also some of the signs that, your friend hasn't been acting like themselves lately, or, you keep inviting them out, but they just want to stay at home. So really even preparing yourself and understanding, like, in my friend circle, what are things I should look out for to even start a conversation or to check in with the person. I think always checking with your friends too, to make sure, is there a reason that you haven't been out for the last 2 weeks? I just want to make sure you're okay. I think it's a lot easier maybe than people have it in their head to check in with friends and to really make it a priority to make sure that everyone's doing okay. And if they aren't, like Amanda said, being there for them and listening and not comparing yourself to them, not saying, oh, well, I also feel like that, or say, oh, it's going to get better, or anything like that. Just validate their feelings. And
Yes.
if it does come to a moment of crisis, also know that there are tools out there to help the person.
Yeah, and I would just add, because sometimes these conversations can feel so difficult and awkward, hence the name Seize the Awkward. But really, if you come from a caring and an earnest place, and you're really checking in with the other person and asking if they're okay, you're only going to do good. As we approach just our last couple of minutes here, I know there are any other advice that you have for the final thoughts for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like, I just want to make it clear how important it is that we are kind of normalizing that we are able to talk about this, and that it's not something to hide. And like you were saying, I think this new kind of younger generation is like embracing that more and more, which is great. I also have siblings who are around that age range, and it's true. And I think honestly, like, access is just kind of the biggest issue right now. It's like they know it's like something's off, or I need to do something, or I want to get help, but like how exactly? How can I afford it? So I think the next step, honestly, and the part of the media and part of everybody really is like, okay, so if we are trying to unpack this right now, then what's next? How can we then get you the help that you need, and how can we kind of make that more accessible?
Yes.
Yeah, I think also just when thinking about talking about mental health on your channels, like we've been saying, just do all your research and make sure you're doing it the right way, because if you want to do good, if you want to use your platform to talk about something and raise awareness, then you really have to do it the right way. And I think, the idea of using social media for good, because I'm sure some of the issues are also because social media and we're inside, on the computer a lot, and that can become really toxic. And maybe just understanding how to walk away and then use your channels to follow things that you really love, and positive channels, and not, that neighbor or friend who maybe you have negative feeling toward. So really using social media for good, whether you're a marketer or an audience member or a creator, celebrity, and figuring out what works for you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both of you. I think it's, the 2 tracks, like let's do more of this talking and conversation as individuals and communities, but also use the models from the discussions we heard earlier about creating a movement that really will move our government to invest in the infrastructure and the access to care that just so desperately needs to be improved in this country. Well, thank you both for this discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We are going to go right into our next topic, and hang tight, because after this we'll have a trivia. We've got a couple good prizes. Unfortunately, our online folks can't join in on this as well, but stay with us, and then after that we'll have a drink here in Subculture. I want to invite to the stage my partner in crime, Kate Emanuel with the Ad Council. Remember Kate? So, Kate, we were lucky to work together on some vote research for Ad Council Edge and Ad Council
Yep.
together, which is exciting this year. And because of the election, this is also something a lot of brands and causes are going to use. Now, you're going to talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. We're going to talk
too.
about some research
Right.
and have a great conversation.
Good.
Yeah.
And I think you're in New York now, but your team, because Kate's from
Yeah,
DC.
I don't like to say this in front of a bunch of New Yorkers, but anyone from DC in the room, because go Nats.
Yeah.
All right, got some DC folks. So
All right, I'll
very
let you head
exciting
out.
times. Okay.
All right.
All right, so really excited to talk today about voting. First up is Andy Bernstein, who's the CEO of Headcount, and they use the power of music and music festivals to register young adults. They've registered 600,000 young adults to date. Andy, come out on the stage. Let's give a round of applause for Andy. All right. Have a seat, Andy. And then I love introducing Yves Matthew, who's going to come out. He's got this awesome bio. So he is a full-time model. He is a musician. He spends, though, a lot of his time volunteering. He plays bingo with seniors at a nearby senior center. He talks to LGBT youth at local shelters. He talks to middle schoolers about drug abuse and using creative ways to express themselves. And lastly, he fosters pit bulls who have been strays or rescued from dog fights. So he's just this incredible person, and I'm going to welcome out to the stage right now. Yves, come on out. Thank you. All right. So we got this thing called an election next year, Andy. Headcount, has been so successful to date at registering young adults. If you look at next year, between Gen Z and millennials are going to make up 37% of the electorate. So it's big. What are you guys doing differently this year to gear up, Andy, and how have you guys been so successful to date?
Well, thank you, and it is a pleasure to be here. We started 15 years ago with the idea of, hey, let's register voters at concerts, and started with a small group of artists that were supportive of our work, and it grew and grew and grew. This year, we're out on tour with Ariana Grande. We've we're in 62 markets right now with volunteer teams and staff registering voters. So when we look at 2020, we know it's going to be our biggest year ever. It's not only an opportunity, but really a calling and a responsibility. And one of the things we're going to do for the first time is we're going to hire full-time organizers in up to a dozen cities. So places like Detroit, Milwaukee, Richmond, Virginia, that really are going to decide this election. And find really creative ways to go beyond concerts. Like in Philadelphia, we're going to work with Federal Donuts, which is a cool boutique donut brand, and we're going to give out donuts and create places that people want to come to get free donuts and register voters there, and be doing these on a daily basis outside of the concert environment. And then the other big push for us is how we're going to work with brands. And we've had really good experiences. Levi's has been a partner, and Ben & Jerry's for many years, Patagonia. And we know that corporate America is going to engage around this election. We are nonpartisan, so we're a very good partner in that regard. And so we're preparing. We've built up a partnership department. We've built up various things that are really plug and play for brands, but also going to take the approach to be very custom, which is what we found brands want. Brands often have their own vision on how they want to do things.
Sure.
And so we try to meet them where they are and fill in gaps, and whether it's registering voters at their stores or creating digital campaigns or things that their brand spokespeople can do. And I think that's going to be a real calling card for Headcount in 2020 is how we work with brands.
Sure. And tell us why you're going a little bit beyond music festivals and those kind of activations.
Well, it's always happened organically.
Yeah.
Way back to the first year, I remember getting an email from one of our volunteers saying, I registered voters at a supermarket in an inner city neighborhood yesterday, and it was great. And we started something called, Community Outreach Day. And eventually, that experience helped us be one of the founders of National Voter Registration Day, where we always go beyond music. But in the recent years, we've seen it. Last year, we did 400 non-music events, a lot of them with March for Our Lives and the Parkland students. And these were things that were really moving the needle. We weren't just registering a lot of voters, but we were connecting with young activists in a way we never had before outside of the music space. So it's very enriching, and the numbers are there. I mean, March for Our Lives was the biggest single day in our history in terms of voter registration. So it works, and it's a big part of how we are growing the organization.
Sure, makes sense. Great. Yves, you are really incredibly talented. You're very busy. You're a model, musician, active volunteer. What are you doing to help get out the vote, and why is it important to you?
Hey everybody, I apologize for my voice. I'm getting over the flu, and I'm also dressed like a fancy mailman.
That is true.
Right. But ways that I try, I'm very on the ground, kind of want to get my hands dirty kind of person. And I work a lot with kids and youth and teenagers. And a lot of the work that I do with teens is kind of just sewing into them that when they get to that age of being able to volunteer, to vote and volunteer, and vote, that their voice does count, because it's very easy to be put into a state of mind of feeling like you don't matter when you see people who look like you or go through the same things that you go through not being heard or acknowledged or recognized. And I think it's important as a votable, is that a word?
Sure.
A votable adult, to show them that it is possible and that it can be done and your voice can be heard. And even though we may not see change tomorrow, we can see change the next day.
Yeah, that's great. Great. I have to ask, because I'm from the Ad Council, about messaging and communications when talking to voters. We just wrapped up some research with Democracy Works, where we looked at different messaging frames across different generations, like Gen Z versus baby boomers. And we kind of want to understand what messages are really motivating to voters. Because I think what we see is a lot of either one size fits all, or political parties are just talking to the hardcore voters. And we're kind of talking at voters. Vote for this candidate, or just vote. And what we found in our research is what the issues was really motivating to people, more so than saying, I vote because I'm a voter, or I feel empowered. So Andy, what do you found has worked for headcount in terms of messaging strategies, nudges, et cetera? And Yves, when you're talking to young people or your peers, what do you tell them about why their vote matters, or what do you find to be more inspiring? Go with Andy first.
For us, I think it also starts with the messenger. And musicians have been a great messenger because they literally have a stage and have a really strong connection. And especially grassroots artists have this kind of community-based model for their own careers.
Yep.
And it lends itself to community organizing and getting the vote out. So one of the things that we're going to do this year, and you're going to see a lot of from other organizations, is something called vote tripling, where you not only ask somebody to pledge to vote, which is kind of a standard thing that probably is not that effective, but you ask them to give the names of 3 friends who you pledge to get out and vote. And then you follow up with them using simple technology, a text message, an email before the election. Say, hey, you said that you'd get Mary, Fred, and Joe to vote. We want to remind you to do that, and here's something you can send them. And there have been studies to show this is effective. So that's kind of our starting point, that the messenger is as important as the message. Now with messages, one thing that is really challenging is that when you're nonpartisan, as soon as you delve into the issue water, there can be a very strong perception of partisanship. And it's very, very challenging, and I think it's challenging for brands. It's definitely challenging for C3 organizations. There are ways, but the kind of way through that is by giving people the tools to put their own message. So one of our tricks at festivals is we have people take a photo at a booth, at a photo booth, and it says, I'm a voter because. And then people fill in their own message, and it can be issues, it can be what comes out of them.
That's great. Great. Yves, what do you think?
For me, I would say what I find most inspiring, or I think is most inspiring, when talking to my kids, I don't have children, but my kids, is honesty and reality. And the reality of many situations is that, sometimes what we're going through, it just sucks, and it's hard. And bringing that realness to any group of people, I feel like, is where you're able to see real growth happen. And I always say this to my family and friends and anyone really, is Black people can't be the only people advocating for Black people. Same with how trans people can't be the only people advocating for trans people. Of course, you can be in a room of people who all agree with you and say, I agree, I agree, I agree. But the real step happens when there's someone who doesn't really understand you and is able to step into this circle and see why something is so important. I can't expect you to understand me if you don't care about me. So taking that time to have those conversations outside of your peer groups and outside of people as I feel when things actually happen.
Yeah. So Yves, I do kind of want to follow up on that
Yeah.
because I think for a lot of certain communities in this country, they don't think their vote matters.
Absolutely.
And you are motivated to vote if you believe your institutions are working for you. But for many in this country, they don't feel the court system represents them, schools, police force, the justice system.
Absolutely.
And I think on top of that, you've got a lot of young men of color who are incarcerated before they're even vote eligible.
Correct.
And then later on that, you've got 6 million African Americans who are disenfranchised because they have felony convictions. So almost 1 in 13 African Americans can't vote today because of a felony conviction. What do we say to folks in that situation who do not feel like they're full participants in this democracy? And you can kind of see why they might feel that way.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
To be real, it's hard to, say anything to someone who's going through something like that, especially if you haven't experienced it or if you know nothing about it. And I encourage you all, if you haven't already, to watch 13th on Netflix. Extremely informative and just really vital to this conversation and what we're talking about right now. And something and I also do some work in Los Angeles with a certain high school of kids who have been victims of gang violence or have experienced gang violence or have lost people in their lives due to police brutality. And it's really difficult to trust and believe that something is going to change or something will happen when you are in the midst of that issue and you're sitting in that problem. And I think that a good way to start this is informing these communities and my community and these families on starting small, because of course we all want to go and march to the nearest police station and scream at the top of our lungs and tell them this isn't right, but sometimes we can start small. And I think it's in Rochester this year you can vote on police accountability, which is something that most people didn't know. And even though it's a victory over here, it's not a loss over here. Like, even though there's something, change is happening over here, it doesn't mean that change won't happen for us on this side. And that's something important just to let young people and all people really know that, hey, just so you know, over here that this is being voted on, and maybe that's something to counsel or fight for in your own city or in your own town, in your own state. And it can be really easy to feel small in that situation because there are so many lives that have been ruined and lost due to mass incarceration for reasons above and beyond. And I think it's insane to me how there can be a young black man who was charged at 15 for having a dime bag and not tried until he's 18 and not released until he's 24, and he can't vote or get a job. But then we have dispensaries of marijuana before doing yoga in LA. But yeah, there's someone who is serving 10 years for driving in a car with a bag of marijuana. And that's just wild to me that an entire life is ruined, but yet this life is being glorified for creating this product.
Yeah, well said. Andy, do you have thoughts about this too?
Well, just on that notion, the cannabis is a really interesting issue because it is something that can bring out young voters.
Yeah.
And there are studies that are showing that. And it gets to the Ad Council's research that there are certain issues, one that are less partisan in perception than others, and that actually can get the vote out. And I think that we've known that abortion is an issue that can get the vote out. We know that guns on the gun rights side is an issue that can get the vote out. And we're starting to see more modern issues develop, and the social justice element of that is critical. And what's happening in cannabis reform right now is that social justice is at the front and center of every state legislation question. And that is now, and it is a very recent phenomenon, this is the central conversation when legislation is being crafted. And so this is something that we see with headcount as these are the kind of things that just people knowing about these things can get people who feel that politics is not relevant to them suddenly start to feel that politics is relevant to them.
Yeah. And how about, because for felons who may be on probation or parole, it's a patchwork for different states. It's like there's also education just to let people, some of them may not know that they can actually vote, right?
Oh, very true. I love telling a story. I was in a cab, and my local town, I live in a small town in Jersey, and my local cab driver, we were talking about local politics, and I asked him who he supported, and he said, and he was this super political cab driver, and he told me that he couldn't vote because of a mistake he made 20 years ago. And I said, listen, man, we're in New Jersey. And I pulled out my phone and I went on the headcount website and checked the felon voting laws. And I was like, you've been able to vote the whole time, man. And there's so much misinformation. And literally I was like, give me your name. I just put it all into our website and registered him to vote while he was driving me home. And so just getting information out there, I mean, it's a huge emphasis for us. Our website has all of that, and we sent 3.5 million emails last year, geo-targeted emails with when early voting starts, when absentee ballot applications are due, and all these things, because who the heck knows these things? It's just not part of daily life. So we have a job to do, and this is where I think brand partners and media and all these things can help out, because there's just gaps. People perceive things that aren't always true. And in the Northeast and in most Democrat-leaning states, the reality is that felons can vote. And we've got to get word out about that.
Yeah. Yeah, this reminds me, I was talking to a political consultant, Republican, who was saying what used to be a high information voter, there was just a level of information voters had. It's just, there's just such a low level of information about candidates, issues, et cetera. All right, I'm going to take a question from the audience. Have you been able to engage people who are not eligible to vote in vote registration efforts?
Yeah, particularly young people. So at the Ariana Grande tour and the Billie Eilish tour, we do a pledge to vote for people who are not yet old enough to vote, and then we email them on the month before their 18th birthday. So that works great. And we also find that, just getting back to the felon question, so our heritage is we started out with the Grateful Dead as our big partner. And we've grown well beyond that, but we still go to all the festivals that are in that world. And in that world, there are many, many people with felony convictions. So we are messaging to some who can vote and some who can't. And one really special moment for us as an organization was when the state of Virginia re-enfranchised hundreds of thousands of people. 2 of our longtime volunteers, we didn't know this. They had never told anybody this. They were like, guys, I can't vote until now. And we had kind of like a little ceremony at one of our booths where these are people who themselves had registered hundreds or thousands of voters and couldn't vote themselves, and we got to register them at our booth.
Yeah, that's really important. I've also, I think our Democracy Works friends have told us how hard it is to engage, off year or a 17-year-old, because unless you can give them something to do right away, it's hard if they're not eligible to vote yet, right? Eve's another great question. This is sort of related to what we were just talking about. So how do you manage the voting privilege, the civil rights movement afforded minorities with fatigued youth that have never experienced democracy work for them?
Wow.
Wow. I bet you have an opinion about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. I mean, there's not enough time here on this thing.
Yeah, we have 6 minutes
for
left.
me to say all that I want to say. But the way that I try to manage it, honestly, is through conversation and accountability. Just making sure that, because my peers keep me accountable, and they keep me up to date and let me know what their concerns are and things that they want to see change. Because I feel like it's we can sit all day and talk about things that we want to do and ideas that we have and things we want to see, but unless action is taken after these words, then it's just words, and we are the ones that are actually able to go out and do these things. So that's what, and I wish that we took these kids more seriously, and because of their situations and because of their backgrounds, and a lot of these kids that I get the chance to hang out with are involved in sex work or are homeless or living on the streets. And, people hear that and they're like, poor you, this is so sad. But to them, this is their life. This is all that they know. And I think that we can learn more from them than they can learn from us in terms of speaking out and being bold and taking charge of things that we care about and things that should matter to all of us. And I mean, the youth are tired, but the youth are talented. And they are also determined. And I feel that this is just a small little stone that is going to be a part of something bigger that they're creating, that they're doing, which is why I spend so much of my time with them, because they teach me more than I teach them.
Yeah, Andy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that too.
Well, in terms of in terms of talking to young people, certainly young people are not monolithic, and there's going to be a lot of different experiences. From our standpoint, a big part of Headcount is the volunteer experience, and we have a Facebook page that our volunteers created on their own years ago, a Headcount Team Leader Facebook page, and this is just a totally active community where we actually, as a staff, headquarters, we try to stay out of it. Let it be owned by the volunteers. And what we found is that so many people with our organization, they get involved for one reason and then stay involved for another. And whether it's a lot of it is that strong sense of community and the empowerment that comes from meeting like-minded people. And that can be just a very powerful force in almost anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also a really important question because Gen Z will be 50% people of color, that generation. So they're going to have a huge impact. It's a diverse, well-educated generation that's going to have a huge impact on our politics and elections. So watch out, right?
Yeah.
I also, Yves, I just want to give a call out to you because I think you're just setting the example and talking about these issues, whether it's LGBT. I don't know, probably, some people know this, but Yves also went viral during the Women's March.
I did.
You want to talk about what you did and kind of how you went viral?
I went to the Women's March 2 years ago, and the year prior to that, there were 55 murders of black trans women, and none of them were reported on the news. And 5 of those women I actually knew, and were people that I was doing life with, and people. And so I went to the march, and I had a sign that said "Trans Women Too," and I posted it, and then I lost service, and I went to a Starbucks and connected to the Wi-Fi, and saw that in an hour it was like 14,000 times, and I was like, what's happening? I don't know what this is. And then the following day it was getting shared and reposted a whole bunch, and so much good came from that, and a lot of bad came from that as well. But I don't care either way, because the fact is that it needs to be said and that these voices need to be amplified. And I will definitely say, too, it shouldn't take someone dying for you to stand up for something. And with me going to the march, after that, I was invited to go speak at a bunch of different places as to why I feel this way and why I stand so strongly for trans rights. But through that, little side story.
Love side stories.
Little side story. So I used to live in Flatbush. I live in Bushwick now. And when I was living in Flatbush, there was like a Target 2 blocks away from me. And of course, through all of this stuff on social media, you get good reviews, bad reviews, neutral reviews. And this person posted that photo of me from the march and said that I was ruining masculinity in America and I need to be killed.
Oh.
And I didn't even know this post was made until people were tagging me. I was the 1,000th comment. It was a tag, and it was oh, this is such and such, and they tagged me. And people in the comments were saying, I've seen him in New York. I can kill him for you. I can find him. And I didn't think anything of it. I was like, oh, okay. So then I called my dad, and I was like, people are trying to kill me. And my dad was like, what's going on? And I was like, the social media thing and all this stuff. And so I was kind of nervous, but not freaking out. But then that day I went to the Target that was down the block, and I'm standing in the self-checkout line, and I have my headphones in, and I see this guy looking at me from the side, and I get stared at a lot because I have tattoos on my face. And so I just kept looking this way, and I saw him move around out of the line to really look at me. And then I took my headphone out, and I was like, hey, can I help you? And he held up a picture of me on his phone. He was like, hey, is this you? And I was like, is it me? He's like, is this you? And I was like, does it look like me? It's probably me. Like, it's me. Can I help you? And he said, because of you, my son thinks it's okay to be gay. And I was like, well, I mean, if your son is gay, he's probably gay. So you should go home and love your son. And he said, my son is wearing crop tops to school, and I found pictures of you on his phone. I was like, I don't know who your son is. These are probably screenshots. Does he have social media? And he told me that if I don't stop posting what I'm posting, that he's gonna blow up my apartment, and he knows where I live. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'm gonna go to the police station, have a good day. And then so I check out my stuff, and I go to the police, and I was like, hey, like, let's go to Target. And the officer was like, why, what's going on? And I was like, come with me to Target. Let's watch the surveillance video. There's a guy saying he's gonna kill me. He knows where I live. My roommates are in danger. Can you please come to my apartment with me? I mean, to Target with me. And then he told me to break down the situation, so I was breaking down the whole thing, and I was like, this is what's going on. And at the end, the officer says to me, well, you know, if you have a high profile on social media, this kind of thing is expected. And I was like, expected? I was like, this person, like, first of all, he's going home to his kid, and I'm scared for his kid, because if he's gonna tell a total stranger he's gonna kill them, what's he gonna tell it to his son? And nothing was solved, nothing was done, nothing was taken care of. And that's just, that small example of what I face as a cisgender man doesn't compare to the violence and the harassment and mockery and disrespect that trans people face, so much to the point where it costs them their lives. Yeah. And so me going to the march and bringing that sign was the least that I could do, and getting the chance to hang out with trans youth is the least that I could do, because they are so much more than just trans. It's a person who's trying to live out their life and achieve things same like you, trying to go to the bathroom and take a piss, like eat food, just do it, just be. Right. And I just feel like any chance that you ever have to speak out for someone else, you should always take it. And I took it, and yeah.
That's well said. Well said.
Yeah.
I think that brings us full circle. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Brings us full circle to why so much is at stake with elections and voting, and these things they're very personal and they matter. Andy, can you just wrap it up for us? What can brands be doing for?
I'm
Derek's
not going to
give you the
top
hook.
that story. Well, I think we are at a unique moment in time, for sure, and we're going to see brands engage around this election at unprecedented levels. And the best thing we say that any brand, and I did a piece in Adweek recently with some thoughts on how brands can best engage, is multiple channels. No one tries to sell a product by doing one thing. Marketing is interdisciplinary. And when brands approach get out the vote or just civic engagement in that way, it can be extremely effective. So whether it's there are a few things that work well, whether it's donating advertising inventory, like through the Ad Council, or getting ambassadors involved, or PR involved, or using digital. Any brand with a big email list can register thousands of voters. These are all easy things to do, and when you start doing more than one or two, it really becomes, it supports the social impact priorities of the brand identity. And that's what Headcount wants to really be a part of, is helping brands unleash that. And I think there are so many people who care a lot about this election and are asking themselves, what can I do? I don't want to feel I didn't do enough. Yep. And there are many, many things that can be done. And when you start doing more than one, you really are going to make a difference, and it's going to become part of the brand DNA if it isn't already.
Well said. Great. Thank you both for joining us today.
You.
Thank you. Thanks to the audience. Yeah, awesome. You guys will get off the stage.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Make sure that you check out the cause and social influence research. Kate, thanks for co-hosting Ad Council, all of those things. We also need to say a big thank you to the Levi Strauss Foundation, Jason and crew, Daniel, Sarah, everybody who has helped us as well from that. So please support their social justice leaders and the movements that they're behind as well. We are going to say goodbye to everybody online, but everybody here, stick around, enjoy a drink on us, and then come back because we've got some wonderful trivia. Good prizes. Let's say what they are. Top prize, $200 in Levi's gift cards, $200 to your favorite charity from Global Giving, as well as the next 3 winners will also get $100 and $100 to charity of your choice as well. So grab a drink, come right back. We'll be with you in about 10 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.